Hello, and welcome back to our consideration of the Women of Troy. Today we're going to be looking at the first Stasimon, the first time that the chorus appears in the play, and we're going to be talking about its significance, both in terms of the significance of the chorus and the role that they play, and then we're going to engage in a kind of line-by-line analysis of this scene, as we have done for the preceding scenes. The reason why I think it's important to first begin with the role of the chorus is firstly because it's poorly understood. That's to say that VCE students often neglect it because it doesn't offer narrative progression. And secondly, because I think in Euripides' case, this chorus is particularly important because its characters are not just choral singers, are not just incidental citizens. They are the women of Troy, the ones that this story is talking about. And in some sense, they deserve just as much focus as the characters who are named. And their existence as an unnamed mass, as many critics note, is particularly moving and important and gives power to what they're saying as representative of a far more collective opinion and a far more broader implication than would exist in other tragedies where the chorus happens to be some selection of singers out of a particular city or out of a particular context. So, firstly, let's talk about the Greek theatrical medium and the role of the chorus in it. And as with most things with relation to tragedy and comedy, we turn to Aristotle's Poetics as our source. Given that 1/5 of almost any Greek tragedy is generally dedicated to choral lines, there are obviously some outliers, but that's a general trend. It's surprising how little of Poetics actually deals with the role of a chorus. Rather, it's given passing reference in one short paragraph. And I'll read it to you now. This is the Samuel H. Butler translation, the translation that had been the accepted translation for a long time and remains the accepted translation in many circles. The chorus, too, should be regarded as one of the actors. It should be an integral part of the whole and share in the action in the manner not of Euripides but of Sophocles. As for the later poets, their choral songs pertain as little to the subject of the piece as to that of any other tragedy. They are, therefore, sung as mere interludes, a practice first begun by Agathon. Yet what difference is there between introducing such choral interludes and transferring a speech or even an act from one play to another? And there's a few things to unpack there, I think. The first is the implication that the chorus should participate in the action, they should advance the narrative. And indeed, Aristotle seems to draw this distinction in Butler's translation, between Euripides and Sophocles, that supposedly in Sophocles, the chorus does advance the narrative and does push forward the storyline, and that in Euripides, they don't. So that's the first observation there. The second observation, and of less relevance to us, but perhaps interesting, is that he observes the trend of newer plays having choruses and choral lines that are not at all linked to their narrative, but rather just musical interludes to sort of break up the play, and there's a real condemnation of that at the end. But let's talk about those first few lines for a moment, because without getting too far into the weeds of like academic scholarship and Greek translation, this is a contested translation in modern classics. While it was the accepted translation for a long time, it was Gerald F. Else, a professor at the University of Iowa, who challenged this translation. I'll read you the opening lines to Else's translation, and I think you'll immediately notice the difference. And the tragic poet should go on the premise that the chorus also is one of his actors. It should be a part of the whole enterprise and an aid to him to winning the competition, not the way it was to Euripides, but rather the way it was to Sophocles. Else's translation changes a single word, but really shifts the meaning and how we should interpret these lines. I mention this because I think that I find it to be the far more likely and the far more convincing translation. That is because it changes the word action to competition, and that really reshapes the translation of this line and how we understand it, because instead it suggests that the chorus and choral lines are not there for dramatic purposes or for narrative purposes or for plot purposes, but rather these choral lines exist to set a kind of a mood and to establish a kind of benchmark by which this play can be judged. It is an aesthetic choice, if you like, rather than a narrativistic one. The reason why this is particularly important is because it clarifies why this mention of choruses, given that they take up so much of plays, is so brief, and is excluded from the mechanics of narrative which are discussed far beforehand in Poetics. Because what this offers to us is an insight that the chorus is a theatrical element, if you like, much like costuming or props or lighting or voice. It is not something that is within the construction of narrative, but rather something that is concerned with the expression of it. So, I think that this distinction is essential because in effect it clarifies the role of the chorus. This is a group of 10 to 15 singers and dancers who are there to offer new insight into the text, rather than developing it any further. And while Weiner, who is a critic that writes particularly well on this subject, goes on to ridicule some of these interpretations because he finds them to be reductive in the academic context, I think that they can be actually quite useful in framing discussions around VCE English, particularly with reference to the women of Troy. The first observation that he makes is one hears somewhere along the way that the chorus exists to elevate commonplace details into universal verities. What he's getting at there is that the chorus turns happenings in the play, incidents, events, bits of dialogue between characters in our case, and turns them into far more universal truths, truths that sort of transcend the particular context and sort of expand into some commentary on the human condition more generally. And I think here in the passage that we're about to analyze, you'll see the chorus doing that. They in fact at one stage use that particularly moralizing term, evil, the absolute bad, right? The absolute sort of rock bottom of societal morality, and they use that word, and I think it suggests that far more universal implication and analysis of what the preceding scenes hold. And the second thing that Weiner ridicules in this article, but I think can often be quite useful in framing the chorus, is one hears that the chorus exists to transform the passions of the characters, which are necessarily diffused, into sharp focus. And this is a far more intricate point, but also one that shouldn't be missed, which is that characters are bound by their narrative existences. That's to say that Hecuba can't sort of suddenly draw out and give you a very precise explanation of her emotional condition for the reason that she is Hecuba. She is the one suffering, and so the sequence of discordant images that really don't join together are indicative of her psychological state at that time. It is as fractured as the image that she's given. But the chorus, because they are unnamed, because they aren't as bound by narrative structure, are able to transcend those barriers and are able to offer these far broader commentaries on the conditions of these characters, on their emotional states as a whole. The reason why I think that's particularly important to note is that the chorus, therefore, acts as a kind of focusing mechanism. There are these sort of divergent rays of light, these divergent lines of inquiry, lines of exposition that could be made, and the chorus focuses them and gets far more closer to the playwright's purpose. It's worth clarifying here that I don't think that the chorus is a mouthpiece for the playwright, or in any case that Euripides doesn't sort of give his ultimate lessons through the chorus. Rather, what happens here is that the chorus, compared to the characters who are bound by narrative, has a bit more license to play with, and so marginally you see more of Euripides peeking through. And these two in particular seem to me to speak to the chorus in our text. I'll read you two extra excerpts from Weiner, because I think that they also sort of help shape our understandings of the chorus and address some of the things that we've already talked about briefly. The first is, through this technique, the director, we should not forget that tragic poets are also directors, can simultaneously give an action specific and universal significance. This is the universal verities that we were talking about, right? The specific and universal significance at the same time, that these actions, Hecuba's images, Hecuba's pain, can at once be the suffering of one woman, but also a far more universal suffering at the hands of war that's quite timeless and unconstrained by the context that Hecuba is inevitably constrained in. The second excerpt that I'll read is, far more important than the literal meaning of the chorus's lines is the emotional mood or tone of a given ode. And this is also particularly important when we discuss the chorus in this particular play. This play, in some sense, constitutes an exception to that rule, in that the chorus isn't just a group of singers, it is those women, and so their experiences are necessarily going to be a bit more specific, and the literal implications of their words is going to be more important than your average play. But I think the overall point remains true, that when the chorus's lines seem overly general, seem not particularly tied to any single experience, but rather an overall statement on suffering, that's because they are that. That's because I think Euripides intends the chorus as a way of summarizing, distilling the emotions of the previous scene, and setting up the play, setting up the stage, setting up the audience's mind for the scenes that will inevitably follow. The chorus in The Women of Troy abides by these observations. They have little narrative bearing on the play generally, but rather speak to the fractured cultural psyche that pervades these women and that pervade these characters. And these Stasimons, rather, are therefore far more concerned with their setting of emotional temperature than their literal claims. They represent the collective body of Trojan women, mourning their loss. And this is the role of the chorus that I think we should hold as we go into this line-by-line analysis of the chorus's first Stasimon. So, we begin with this dialogue with Hecuba, where the chorus enters and they say, "Hecuba, did you shout aloud, or was it a howl of agony?" I think notice the contrast in those two differing options that the chorus offers. The first is a shout. A shout is controlled, it's measured. A character chooses to shout as a means of emphasis. It's a triumph of voice. And yet, the contrast is a howl of agony, which is so much more animalistic, so much more involuntary, and so much more uncontrolled. It isn't a choice, but rather it's an obligation. If you cast your mind back to the imperatives that we were talking about last video, these are those imperatives. She must howl. There's no other means of comprehending or dealing with this grief. How far did it carry? Through the walls we heard a sound that made us shiver. That notion of farness, distance, I think is particularly important because it speaks both to temporal distance and to a kind of spatial distance. The spatial distance is obviously literal. The shout carries carries a long way, but that temporal distance is also important. That over time, even in the present day, the wails and screams of Hecuba echo. I point you to the poem in the postscript that Taylor includes, and it's a poem that you can comment on, and the fact that these same voices, these same mourning women that inevitably come after each war, their voices still reverberate in the modern day, and this is the context in which we consider that. We heard a sound that made us shiver. This shout, this screech, is almost a kind of resonant frequency, right? A kind of, if you pluck a G string on some instrument, 5 meters away, the G string on another instrument will vibrate. And it's that kind of resonance that I think we detect here. The play is an appeal to conscience, and the human conscience vibrates at the same frequency as Hecuba's cries. There's something moving about them, something that demands our pity and our care. As we hid in the ruins, wretched women of Troy facing a life of slavery. That word wretched, I think, has many connotations that can be quite useful in analysis. The sort of sadness, despair, misfortune that's intertwined in it. Then Hecuba says, "My women, my girls," that repeated a sense of responsibility as queen, that she can't, or really never ever shakes throughout this play. Already the Greeks deploy their ships, their hands reach for the oars. And this is really quite a lovely, or rather terrifying, but a lovely image for analysis, right? If the ships that Hecuba describes are the ships of fate, if the references to nautical metaphors and sailing analogies are that of her fate, then the Greeks reaching for the oars are a seizing of control over her fate, over her future. And that's what we sense in Hecuba's exclamation there. It's an image that I think is sort of can be very nicely exploited for analysis. Then the chorus says, no, will they really drag us away from our homes and ship us overseas to others, to be dragged, to be shipped? These are the words of product, of merchants, and of sales. And here the women are reduced to that. Again, we reference that sort of opening stage instruction that introduces Andromache. She's dragged in, or rather wheeled in, on a baggage wagon holding a styanax, right? And that's the first image of her. She is loot. She is baggage. All the loot finds its way down to the Greek ships. I can't bear it. Soon we will hear them shout, "Get moving, you Trojan women. Hey, slave, kiss your home goodbye." There's something quite unusually violent about that. It's unusually violent because of the juxtaposition, that it is a juxtaposition between the sort of tenderness of the kiss and the violence of separating a woman and her children from their home. And it's a distinctly modern cruelty, I note. This is something that Taylor adds into his translation. Other translations, like Lattimore's one, doesn't have, or don't have, that kind of connotation. But I think it's, again, a nice comment to show an awareness of translation, awareness of mediums and how they change across time, that Taylor chooses to make this decision to create this sort of endearing image of mother and child and home, and the sort of severing of all of those ties as this sort of most horrific and abject cruelty. Hecuba then says, "But not Cassandra, not her. Dear heaven, leave that child inside." We're reminded of two things there. The first is the cruel divine indifference in this world, that she prays to the gods, calls for the gods in vain. They will not help her. And the second thing that we're reminded of is her vulnerability, that she must pray to the heavens in the first place. Again, deserving of our pity. I think so often it's tempting to generalize Hecuba as this sort of, strong leadership figure. And yet, in this scene at least, she's sort of anything but that, right? Quite powerless, and quite unable to discharge her duties, if you see them as her duties. "But not Cassandra, dear heaven. Leave that child inside, my God-crazed daughter in her visionary ecstasy." There's two things to draw from that phrase, visionary ecstasy. The first is that there's the only joy, the only ecstasy that can be accessed in this play occurs through a kind of delusion. But the second also is that God-crazed daughter paired with it. That there's an acknowledgement of the violence of Cassandra as something that's deeply disconcerting even to Hecuba, even to the queen who's on her side. And there's something quite sadistic about it. I don't think that visionary ecstasy is intended as a sort of endearing term, or a term that sort of glorifies Cassandra in any way, rather renders her slightly grotesque, and her actions and her suggestions later on in the play slightly grotesque. "Not a poor mad girl, how can I grieve more than I do?" Here you sense the sympathies of Hecuba for the vulnerable. She will say later on, my little darling, right, about Astyanax, when he's about to be murdered, my little boy. And here you get that same sense with poor mad girl. There's an instinct to protect the vulnerable, to protect Astyanax, to protect Polyxena, to protect Cassandra. And yet she will not be allowed to discharge any of these affections. She will not be allowed to look after them in any sense. And that's the sort of tragedy of Hecuba, and the tragedy of care for the vulnerable in the women of Troy, that it's not allowed to succeed. but rather what succeeds is the depraved humanity that attempts to punish the vulnerable. They kill a Styanax because it is the cruelest thing available. They choose to kill Polyxena as a sacrifice to Achilles because it's the cruelest option possible. Agamemnon chooses Cassandra as his concubine because it's the cruelest option possible. That is the intention, that is the goal in this play. And finally, on this page, Hecuba asks, is there more pain for me? Well, of course there is. And that kind of dramatic irony, I think you'll see, pervades Hecuba's speeches. She never quite sort of loses hope, and that's the tragedy that surrounds her. On the next page, we begin with this sequence of really searching questions. It begins in Hecuba's monologue, who must live in slavery, right? Do the living or the dead have it better, in essence? Then the chorus asks a series of questions. What new horror must I suffer? Surely the Greeks don't mean to kill me here. Are they mustering in their ships, getting ready to row in groups by the stern? These questions about fate, about what the future holds, and it inspires a real sense of sympathy because it reveals to you their abject powerlessness. They don't have any control over what's going to happen here, and that's confronting and saddening. But also the chorus saying, I'm shaking with terror. You get, again, that sense of reverberation, right? That sense of resonance. If you imagine the staging, they're literally trembling as Hecuba's limbs tremble. And as she says, let my limbs shake with it then. Well, these women are also shaking. This is a common experience of horror, of grief, of war's ultimate tragedy. And then finally, you get this image of sort of rowing from the stern being the back of the boat, right? And you get this sense of a life driven, propelled by a force that is not their own. The Greeks sort of row these ships from the back, and they're pushed forth at the ship's front, a kind of battering ram before fate. And they have no agency over how they're going to confront fate. And that's, again, a nice illustration of their abducted agency. My children, a blasted mind never sleeps. I came out here at dawn, but there is no relief. Notice that's sort of a short declarative amid really sort of very long, winding poetry from Hecuba, as images sort of, bleed into even the same sentence, and sentences drag over multiple lines. This is the certainty. There is no relief. A real sense of absolution, putting it after a caesura, before an end stop. That's a full stop at the end of the line. Real confidence in that. That's the only thing that there is confidence in this world. The chorus then asks, is there any decision? No message from the Greeks about slave allocation? Who will be the master of my grief? In the word allocation, you again sense this idea of women as product in this play, as a kind of thing to be exported, to be shipped off, to be shipped overseas. But also that grief, even emotions don't belong to these women anymore, but rather they belong to their masters. And even grief cannot be free, it's sort of held captive in this way. Then Hecuba says, O you gods, where in my misery shall I go? And here you get a really interesting image to play with in your analysis, and I think it's worth at least trying it at some stage, which is that misery is made into a kind of space, and it happens in Hecuba's opening monologue too, and I think I noted it there. Misery is made into a physical space, and there you can get a real sense of the physical entrapment of Hecuba by this psychic grief. This kind of box that she's put in, but the bars are not physical, they're psychological. Where in my misery shall I go? A sort of wandering actor, sort of strutting back and forth, unsure of what the future holds, and sort of unable to write her own script, unable to write her own fate. Like a drone in a hive. There's a comedy to or a sort of cold, dark comedy to Taylor's choice of word here. Because she is, of course, a queen. She reminds us at the end of that little chunk as a queen half divine, right? And the sort of playing with the image of the sort of drone in a hive and the queen bee, I think shows you the degradation of status that she immediately suffers. or an image of death still in the flesh. Again, Hecuba is reduced to a metaphor here in the chorus, and this is the sort of focusing that Weiner was talking about. That, she is death, suffering, made physical, maximum suffering. It's a torment worse than death. It gets said multiple points in the play, but it's true. Hecuba's fate is probably worse than death. There's no redeeming feature of it. And so she's reduced to a kind of a shadow, right? This sort of two-dimensional dark figure that has no qualities that make it worthy of, or rather, sort of gets no relief. She's sort of plunged into constant darkness in this play, and humanity is rendered thin. Humanity is rendered two-dimensional as brittle, and that's the reality of war, that it reduces humans, reduces real, actual people to these shadows, and that's the tragedy of it. Cool. The chorus then says, "Oh, the pity of it, the pity." Notice enclosed word order there. You have to imagine this sort of, performed on stage. It's very late at night. I'm not going to attempt to perform it, but the pity of it, the pity, the enclosed word order, the circularity of this pity matches the circularity of grief, matches the circularity of suffering. There's no relief that can be offered from it. Rather, it's a self-perpetuating circle that pushes itself forward. What words, what howling can give tongue to a pain that no animal could endure? This is the challenge of this play, and it's not the first time that Euripides sets out this challenge, but it's what this play attempts to do, is to give voice to this kind of suffering, give voice to this kind of otherwise silenced side of Homer's story, and no animal could endure it. And again, we return to that reduction of people to animals, that creature Hecuba, my rack of pain, my bed of cold stone, those images of ritual sacrifice. Here again, we get that image of animals. That's what people in war are reduced to. Never again, in the shadow of Mount Ida, will these hands of mine pass the shuttle back and forth between the threads as I sit at my loom. There's quite a bit to unpack here, and I think it's actually some new things to consider about, well, here, the chorus, right? In the shadow of Mount Ida, firstly, Mount Ida is this sort of very spiritually important mountain to the Trojans, and its importance as a spiritual institution makes it a symbol of institution, a symbol of the establishment, right? And so there's a kind of abduction of agency as well, as sort of these women, the chorus, sits in the shadow of Mount Ida. These are their memories of Troy. And indeed, the memory that we get told about is one of domesticity, as the chorus sits at their looms, passing the thread back and forth. This is a life that they came from. And I think Taylor, even if Euripides doesn't, intentionally makes this seem quite repetitive, and seem slightly undesirable as a kind of lifestyle, and forces us to question whether there was indeed a sense of freedom in Troy. Sure, there's a kind of small sense of freedom in passing the shuttle back and forth, literally freely moving between these threads, whereas now they're caged by their misery, by their grief, and by their Greek captors. But also, if their lives are spent sitting at their looms, is this kind of one form of slavery traded for another? Again, we'll get far clearer implications of that in Andromache's monologue, and later on in our discussions of Helen. But it's worth keeping that in mind. This is not an unambiguous endorsement of Troy, to the extent the chorus and Hecuba seem to think it is. That lifestyle, at least to Taylor's modern audience, seems quite confronting and slightly undesirable. Cool. I harrow my heart with the sight of my dead sons, the last time before greater sorrow overwhelms me. The sort of sense of overwhelming sorrow that, like water, it kind of swells and then lowers, and this is the reality of sorrow in this play, that it can never be contained. then you get that word that I think is unusual in a play. You rarely get that sense of absolution, and Euripides actually puts that in, not Taylor. In most translations, it's taken as evil, and there's a sense of moral judgment there. In a sense, it's an appeal to the conscience of their readers, or of their audience, rather, in the theatre. And it's appeal to Greek morality, right? This is a time when sort of philosophy and these sort of elemental ideas of morality were beginning to emerge as sort of absolutes. And in this world where morality was absolutes, Euripides is saying, well, war and its consequences are an absolute evil. They're an absolute moral bad. By the turbulent Eurotas, again, image of turbulent waters, we're reminded of Hecuba, fate as a boat, etc. Helen's loathed household, under the Troy sacker's heel, this sort of image of physical oppression, right? That their subjugation as slaves, as loot, isn't just a sort of emotional one, it's also a physical one. Cool. Then we get to and the land of Mount Etna, which scalds its slopes with Hephaestus's fire. It's not our first image of fire, but quite an early one, actually. And it's worth remembering here whose fire it is. It's the god in Rome called Vulcan, where we get the word volcano from, actually. And a sort of very hyper-masculine god, in a sense, god of fire. And it's highly destructive. And I think remember that flame image, because it recurs when we're describing the sort of lust of men, or their destructive power in this play. And it becomes very important when we consider what the war's origins are. It is this fire that seems to sear everything, that comes from a kind of male ego, if you like. Pride of place for integrity, and is renowned for its brave men. And of course, in the next scene, I guess you can't offer spoilers. In the next scene, Talthybius distributes the women, and Hecuba goes to Odysseus, right? And her complaint about Odysseus isn't sort of Odysseus as warrior, it's Odysseus as human. She calls him the most immoral of the Greeks, the most deceitful, right? Odysseus is if you like, a man entirely lacking in those qualities, lacking in bravery, lacking in integrity. And so there's a sense of irony here. Cool. Whose dark streams like hair as they flow become reddened. This image of gentle beauty, I think, is disrupted by a sense of bloodshed, disrupted by a very grotesque image of bloodshed there. Blessed with plenty is that valley, breeding heroes hardened for war. That enjambment emphasizes a very unsettling reality to me, that the purpose of life, that children are born in this world in preparation for war. And this is true, right? The Greeks sort of had a very well-stocked army, and particularly in Sparta, but also in Athens. Children are born for the purposes of fighting, for the purposes of defending their country. And we're lucky in modern times not to have an analogy for this. But look, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that conscription was mandatory, and it still is in many countries. And here Euripides suggests an overwhelming sense of tragedy to that, that life is reserved for death. Its children are born to die in war, and that's the purpose that they're given. And I think that's enormously tragic. Then we sort of enter the final few lines of this first Stasimon. Does he have some news for us? This caesura, the sort of full stop in the middle of the line cutting off the rhythm, gives a sense of palpable anticipation, but also fear. Then this image of Talthybius, I think it's very, very important, because you have to imagine the staging. Again, engaging with stage directions, engaging with descriptions of what's actually happening on stage is going to earn you more marks, because it shows an understanding of this as not just a physical text, words on the page, but as a play. I can see him hurrying at a brisk march in our direction. That brisk march is two things. It's impending fate. The sort of, literally this kind of freight train that's coming for Hecuba and coming for the people. And secondly, it's a suggestion that there's no agency in Talthybius. He marches this sort of walking in formation as a part of the Greek war machine. He's just a cog, conditioned to act, forced to act in the way that he does. He marches on the orders of the Greek generals, and throughout the play, he's a herald, he's a messenger, right? And he's literally sent by Odysseus, sent by Agamemnon, sent by Menelaus, and there's no agency afforded to him. And as we negotiate what kind of a character Talthybius is in the next passage and in subsequent ones, we consider Talthybius as both a victim and the inflictor of damage, because he, I guess like the other Greeks, but more than the other Greeks, lacks agency in this particular situation. And also that image of marching, if you want an analytical sort of foothold there, compare that to the final image, right, where the chorus says, "Let us march down to the Achaean fleet." Is there a sense of liberty there? Yes. Is there a sense of freedom there? Yes. Is there also a sense of tragedy, if you like, sort of overarching sadness that they have to march to this place because they have no choice? Also, yes. And I think that's the same duality that you can find in Talthybius, and you can compare those in an essay. The Dorian Greeks have reduced us to slavery. This final point that I'll make, and it's a reduction of us, not just reduction of our pride, reduction of our status, but reduction of us, reduction of these women, these people. Humanity is reduced into something worthless, into something without any value. And I think that's the ultimate tragedy in this play, and the chorus nicely, very, very powerfully focuses it on a universal truth. And this is, I remind you, what Weiner says about the role of the chorus. The role of the chorus is to transform the passions of the characters, which are necessarily diffused, into sharp focus. Well, here is the sharp focus, right? These are the universal verities that war reduces not just sort of abstract concepts, but actual humans to a kind of slavery. All right. It's a depressing note to end on, but hopefully that was helpful, and I'll see you next time.